I'm going to offer you some brief tips about the Hinckley assignment, which is the second part of Milestone 2. The first thing I'll point out to you is Hinckley Part C, the milestone case. The fact is, the most important thing to take away from Part C of Hinckley is there is no historical milestone case in the sense of a case opinion dealing with the characteristics noted in the prompt. Don't try to find one. It doesn't exist. Instead, you should consult relevant gun legislation that did emerge from the Hinckley assassination attempt that also would impact or involve Second Amendment rights. In the assignment guide, there's more detail about this. Part 2 of the assignment guide, page number 120, talks at greater length about the historical milestone case problem and also includes some ideas that you can use for Hinckley Part C. Those appear on page 121. Let's talk next about Hinckley Part A. Hinckley Part A concerns the Model Penal Code test. That is the test that you're supposed to use for Hinckley Part A. It's a historical fact. The jury at Hinckley's actual trial concerning his attempted assassination upon the U.S. president, the jury did have to use the Model Penal Code test to determine if Hinckley was insane. It is a legal standard for determining insanity when the defendant has claimed insanity. So we have to use the MPC test. That's the test that the jury was required to use at Hinckley's trial because that test was the law in the place where Hinckley was tried at the time of his trial. Another historical fact is Hinckley's jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. We are not asked in Hinckley Part A to think of some other result because we already know what the result was. They found him not guilty by reason of insanity. What we are being asked to do, I think, is to justify how the jury could have possibly reached the verdict that it did. To do that, we should examine three different things because they're all relatively important. First, the Model Penal Code test, which we've just covered, the burden of proof at Hinckley's trial. In other words, which party had the burden of proof and what was the burden of proof that was imposed on that party. The last thing we should take a look at are historical facts, key historical evidence from Hinckley's trial that seems to be the most persuasive in explaining what the jury's verdict was. And we already know what that verdict was, not guilty by reason of insanity. Now the MPC test is in the assignment guide. You don't have to go looking for it. It is on page 123, part 2 of the assignment guide. You can see at the top there is a citation. It even shows you how to cite it. Use this copy of the Model Penal Code for your discussion of Hinckley Part A. The burden of proof question is something that you can look into in detail. If you'll go to this source, Linder Famous Trials, the Hinckley trial transcript excerpts, you're going to find the actual instruction that the judge gave to the jury on the burden of proof. And I've called up the resource. The discussion that's important is near the bottom of the page. So I'll just flip over to the next screen where I've already called it up. You can see exactly what the court said to the jury. Here's what you're instructed to do with the evidence on the burden of proof. And it also tells you which party had that burden of proof. It was not on Hinckley. The government had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Hinckley was not suffering from a mental disease or defect, In other words, they had to show he was not insane by proof beyond reasonable doubt. That sounds like a pretty tall order, and I believe we ought to think about that in connection with determining Hinckley's mental state defense and what the jury's verdict would have to be. Now, be sure you defend your response, whatever your response is going to be. You can't just settle on your own opinion. It has to be supported with something historical in the record, and that turns us to Part C. We need to dig into the historical evidence and come up with something that seems reasonably persuasive to us as supporting the jury's outcome in the trial. And again, Part 2 of the assignment guide, page numbers 119 and 120. You have an entire list of factual resources that you can consult. And I can tell you, the more you look into the Hinckley matter, the more interesting things you discover about the man, what he did, and his mental composition. Very interesting individual, also quite dangerous at the time because of his obsession and compulsion, among other things. His mental illness, I think it put on a pretty good case that his mental illness was tied to what he tried to do. So now let's look again in a little more detail about the structure. And this is just a roadmap, basically, how to put this thing together. First, you should summarize the test because that's what you're going to apply for Hinckley Part A. You should summarize it in your own words, and you should not go into collateral information like how did we get this test, what's its background and history, who derived it, why did they put it together. You don't need to go into that. You're going to need more room, all the room you can spare for other things. The second thing to cover in your work is the burden of proof. We've already touched on that, and I hope that gave you some leads for how to approach this. Think about this. If you look at the Hinckley trial evidence, you might conclude that the prosecution put on a pretty good case, that Hinckley may have understood what he was doing. The defense also put on a pretty darn good case that because of a mental illness, Hinckley did not understand what he was doing, or he was compelled, notwithstanding the law, to do what he did. If the evidence from both parties is about even in terms of its persuasiveness, what has to be the outcome in a criminal trial? Consider that question in light of the burden of proof and which party had the burden of proof at Hinckley's trial. Now, the research of the historical facts is going to support what I just said in general terms, which is here is what the prosecution could point to as reasonably persuasive, and here is what the defense put on, which was also reasonably persuasive. In any case, don't just rely on your opinion. Support your ideas with historical facts. Now, do not overlook also that there is a model in here for you to put all this together. It's a writing sample you can use for ideas. It begins on page 127 and runs through 129. It covers Hinckley Part A and Hinckley Part B. It is one way to approach the Hinckley component of Milestone 2. It is not the only way. I didn't put it together as the way to approach this. So it is a good model, perhaps, to give you some ideas about structure and content. And that's all I have to say about Hinckley Parts A and Hinckley Parts C. I will compile a separate video for Hinckley Part B.